So I'm here today with Emmet O'Connor to discuss his book, biography really, Rotten Prod, The Unlikely Career of Dongaree Baird, and has this very beautiful cover. Do you want to talk about the cover, Emmet?
Well, the cover is from a painting by William Connor of Shipyard Workers, one of a number he did in Belfast, and we produced it, or reproduced it, courtesy of the National Museums and Art Galleries of Northern Ireland.
It's very beautiful and really sets...
I think it's an excellent painting.
Yeah, it sets the tone for the whole book. Yeah. You know, maybe first of all we might talk a little bit about the background of history of what's happening during this period in the 1910s, 1920s in Ireland and the wider world more particularly. You know, that it is a time when Ireland is going through its revolutionary period, and it's also involved in this World War. And there's a very strong political theme going through that is kind of dominating and has dominated the historical narrative for a long time. And works like yours help to redress that imbalance in the historiography, where what's happening in Labour has largely been ignored. Even though I suppose that tension between Labour and what's happening in the political arena, it's very closely united, isn't it? Because you have for example, the war-imposed inflation, which really starts to come into play in 1916 and 1917, and that leads to a lot of industrial unrest and growth in the labour industry. Maybe you'd talk a little bit about that, if I haven't spoken too much about it first.
Yeah, that period of labour history has been called the Age of Agitation. Between 1889 and 1923, and Labour went through these three phases of industrial unrest, and that was particularly problematic in Belfast because you had the increasing tensions over the constitutional question. So that's really how I got interested in James Baird, because he was right at the centre of all of that, and I was curious to know how Labour activists dealt with the problems of the increasing tensions arising from the national question. And I feel that the story has been told from an Orange perspective, from a Green perspective, but not from a Labour perspective. So I wanted to concentrate on Labour and not use Labour as a cipher to make a point about nationalism or unionism, but to look at these people in themselves and how they dealt with the problems that were affecting them, and in particular how James Baird, as just one example, addressed these problems. And I was attracted to Baird partly because I'd come across him before in relation to the big farm strike in Waterford, but also because he left behind some record of his thoughts and activities, however fragmented that was.
And you talk about them being quite scant but very strong in what was there, you know, that his opinions were very strongly stated in those records.
Yeah, he did come across as a man of very sort of firm views, and he expressed those views in letters to the press and to colleagues, and internal correspondence within the Irish Transport and General Workers Union. Now, there's not a great deal that he left behind, but for so many others there was virtually nothing at all. So, you know, there's so many of these rotten prods who were just, they just disappeared really into the mists of time. And we really know very, very little about them. Whereas with Baird, at least we have something. Yeah.
And yet you describe him like as the de facto leader of one of the biggest strikes in Irish labour history. But it really, that strike and he as a character have both retreated into obscurity because of contemporary values. So you've done a lot here to redress that, I think.
Yeah, it's curious. I mean, the big Waterford farm strike involved 1,500 labourers, maybe about 500 other workers, town workers who came out in sympathy. It went on from May until December of 1923. It amounted virtually to a civil war within the county. You had the deployment of special troops on the part of the Army, the Special Infantry Corps. 2 battalions were sent to Waterford. Martial law was declared in July of 1923. It was really quite a remarkable struggle. And yet, I never heard of it. When I was growing up, I never heard of it.
And you grew up in Waterford.
Yeah, that's right.
And you were involved in labour circles as well in Waterford.
Yeah, you know, came from a sort of a labour background, and yet nobody spoke about it. I'd never heard of it. And it's only by accident that I came across it.
And it's an absolutely fascinating story and involved the whole southeast. But maybe we'd go backwards in time before we come forwards to talk his background. For somebody who went into labour was quite unusual in that he was born on a small farm.
Yeah,
a very small farm, 10 or a 5 acre farm or something.
That's right, yeah. And his father was a tenant farmer with 10 acres, and he died soon after James was born. And then his mother remarried a farmer with he had about 23 acres, I think. But obviously it was a very impoverished background. And how he got the apprenticeship in Harland and Wolff is not clear, unfortunately. There's so much about his origins that we don't know. But Harland and Wolff was expanding into marine engineering in the 1890s. So it was a sort of a value-added process, as we would call it now. Before they just built the ships, and then they would buy in boilers and engines. Now they're starting to make the boilers and engines themselves. It was the final phase of the Industrial Revolution as it affected Victorian Belfast. So that might have created an opportunity for somebody like Baird to move in there, get an apprenticeship, service time, and then become a boilermaker, or more specifically a caulker. That was exactly his job. He caulked the ships to make them waterproof.
And anybody who's been through the Titanic exhibition will have almost shared the experience of being that up close to the hull and seeing that being done in the exhibition, I think, isn't it?
Yeah, it's fascinating. Yeah. There's a wonderful museum there which illustrates the process and gives you a sense of what it was like to work in the shipyard at the time. And it must have been very impressive, because you had, at its peak, you had about 20,000 workers in Harland and Wolff alone. And they also had plants then in England and Scotland. But it was a world unto itself. Obviously, people like Baird would have been at the centre of it all. They would have been the key workers in what was called the Black Squad. They did the heavy iron work, which you also needed caterers and cleaners, and there was even a fire brigade with uniformed firemen, and there was an internal bus service and so on. So it was a complete world unto itself, really.
And he gradually becomes politicised, or is it a faster process?
It's a slow process, but I think it came with his union work, because he joins the union once he completes his apprenticeship. Now, he couldn't join as a labourer because it was a crafts union and very craft conscious. And they boasted about the fact that
the union being?
The union was changed its name a number of times, was the United Iron and Steel Boilermakers and Shipyard Workers. And
so this is what they call an amalgamated union.
Yeah, what in Ireland would be known as an amalgamated union. Yeah. Amalgamate was a polite name for British-based union. Yeah. And later on there would be tensions between Irish unions and the amalgamated unions. This is very much a traditional amalgamated crafts union. Traced its origins back to the railway workshops in Manchester in 1834. The members addressed each other as worthy brother. And they boasted about the fact that they hardly ever had any strikes. In fact, the union boasted that it would be impartial in strikes, because it would set the interests of the industry first, and it could mediate between the strikers and the employers. So, like most craft unions, their weapon of choice really was control of entry into the trade through the apprenticeship system. Mm-hmm. That was a much more effective system of controlling the supply of labour than strikes, and of course it was a lot cheaper. So there would have been a fairly generous union in terms of benefits for their members. And there were a lot of health problems that went with working in the shipyards. Yeah. Baird himself became almost entirely deaf in one ear after a number of years working there. But problems with eyesight would have been common. And of course other problems like injuries from falling objects and so on. These were notoriously common.
I imagine lung problems as well from all the fumes.
Absolutely, yeah.
So he was one of hundreds of rotten prods and thousands of Catholics who were driven from their place of work by loyalists in 1920. Yeah. And these expulsions marked the end of the Belfast so-called Red Years, distinguished by the engineering strike in 1919 and the municipal elections in 1920. Maybe we'd talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, that term rotten prod raises a lot of eyebrows these days in these woke times, where you're not supposed to say things like that. But that was a term used by unionists to describe any Ulster Protestant who was not a unionist, basically. You could be a liberal, a Labourite, a nationalist, whatever. If you were not a unionist, then you were seen as being on the other side.
So this is unionist with a capital U in the political sense, rather than a member of a union.
Oh yeah, unionists as Ulster unionists, politically as distinct from trade unionists. But in the case of Baird, I think his politics developed with his union membership, and he joined the union about 1898. Now, in 1903, Belfast Trades Council called a meeting to become a branch of the Labour Representation Committee, which later became the British Labour Party. And Baird was a delegate from his union to that meeting. So he's engaged with Labour politics off and on over the next, 15 years. But it's really with the shorter hours movement in 1918 that he starts to rise to some kind of prominence. He's a branch secretary, and he's working away, but at a fairly low level within the union.
This is the so-called 44 hours, is it?
Yeah, this is before that.
Okay.
He's not, as a branch secretary, he's not a full-time official. He's a lay official. But in 1918, certainly by the summer of 1918, it looked as if Germany was going to lose the war. But it would probably continue on for another year, they thought. But they thought, well, we're going to win the war, and now's the time to prepare for the post-war world, because in a post-war world, there's going to be a glut of ships on the market, and they're going to be laying off workers. So we've got to deal with that. One way they thought they could deal with it was by demanding shorter working hours. The working week was a 9-hour day, 6 days a week, 54 hours. So there was talk about cutting it back to 47 hours. Some wanted 40 hours. In Glasgow, they wanted 30 hours. So these debates were going on. And Baird comes to prominence as a leader of what was called the shorter hours movement. Now, the war ends quite suddenly then in November of 1918. And you have immediately demands for a reduction in the working week. And the union is quite divided over what figure it should look for as a maximum for the working week. So Baird is at the kind of more militant end, pushing for the shorter week and looking for a 44-hour week. So this leads to an unofficial strike in Belfast in January and February of 1919, which is known as the 44-hour strike.
And then that ends successfully or unsuccessfully? No,
the strike really collapses. It's an unofficial strike. It involves nearly 40,000 workers. It's a huge enterprise. And the General Strike Committee, which met in Garfield Street in Belfast, it was known for a time as the Belfast Soviet, because they controlled so much about what was going on in the town. They controlled electricity and water supplies and so on, issued permits to shopkeepers who could stay open for essential services and so on. It's likely that Baird is involved with the strike committee. Some speculate that he was removed from the strike committee because he was too militant. But after the strike collapses, the Dublin Castle sends in the troops in early February, and they take over the power plants, and that leads to the end of the strike. But after the strike collapses, Baird is one of those who's very critical of the leadership for not doing more to promote the struggle. And one issue that arose during the strike was whether they should make common cause with workers in the south of Ireland or accept help from the Irish Transport and General Workers Union. And the
so
more
he
militant
moves
workers,
increasingly away from his own.
Yeah, this gradually leads them away from the amalgamateds.
Yeah.
And leads them to become more critical.
I suppose the key tense period for James Baird is in 1919 and 1920. when things come to a rather sad pass or else a glorious end. I'm not sure which you'd call it.
Yeah. Yeah, Belfast goes through a period of radicalism, like many places in Europe did. A sort of two red years, mid-1918 to mid-1920. But the 44-hour strike was part of that. So too were the municipal elections of January 1920, in which Labour wins 13 out of 60 seats on the corporation.
I'm fascinated by this because this is coming in the wake of the December 1918 election, when Labour basically stands down. And we tend to have this view that Labour stood down. But in fact, in those elections and later in the county council elections, I think there's a very strong Labour presence, not just in Belfast, but throughout the country as well, isn't there?
Yeah, it was Labour in the south that stood down. You see, part of the problem with Belfast Labour is that it's not really fully integrated into the Irish Labour movement at this time. It's a sort of a Labour movement unto itself. But when the Irish Trade Union Congress and Labour Party said, we're going to stand down from the Westminster elections, the Belfast Labour activists were very disappointed with that, and 4 Belfast Labour candidates stood and got about 22% of the vote on average in the constituencies that they contested. But then in January of 1920, you've got municipal elections, and throughout Ireland, Labour does very well, particularly in Belfast. And Baird is one of a number of Labour candidates elected to the corporation. And this is how he earns the sobriquet Dongaree, because he immediately requests that meetings of the corporation should be held in the evening to facilitate attendance by
workers.
By workers. Yeah. And on one occasion, he turns up at a council meeting in his dungarees, his working clothes, and he says, "Look, I was at a shift in Queen's Island in the shipyard, and I didn't have time to change." But he's hammered in the unionist press, particularly the Belfast Newsletter, for this, who feel it's an insult to the magnificent city hall that they've so recently built at great expense, and that he's, deliberately trying to, trying to attract attention to himself. It alarms the unionists because they feel that Labour is a Trojan horse of nationalism, because Labour is largely anti-partition, not pro-home rule, but they'd prefer home rule to partition. That's because their view is that partition would lead to a sectarian state. That, James Connolly famously said that partition would lead to a carnival reaction. And that's often taken as a kind of unique prophetic insight. But in fact, it was unique only in its eloquence. All Labour activists believe that, in Belfast, in Dublin, in London. So they're all against partition. They believe it would be the worst option. So the unionists want to neutralise Labour, ideally get rid of Labour, and they start discussing ways of doing this. Now the opportunity comes then in July, and it's another in the series of shipyard expulsions, because ever since the first Home Rule crisis, Catholics in the shipyard are treated really as political hostages. When you have the first Home Rule crisis, they're expelled. The second Home Rule crisis, they're expelled from the shipyard. The third Home Rule crisis, Protestants are expelled as well. Radical Protestants, for being liberals, for being Labour activists, or even independent Orangemen, so-called rotten Prods. And then in 1920, again, Protestants are targeted if they're Labour activists. Because if you're a Labour activist, it's assumed, rightly or wrongly, that you're, anti-partition. So about a quarter of the first wave of expulsions, of expellees, were Protestants. And Baird becomes a leader of the expelled workers, one of a number of expelled workers associations. This leads them to a lot of campaigning in England. It also leads them to make more contacts with the South. Ultimately, it leads him to a job as an organiser with the Irish Transport and General Workers Union, which he takes up in May of 1922.
And this is based as an organiser in the southeast?
Yeah, he's based in the southeast, and initially he operates in Carlow. So, and then
he's married to a Tipperary woman. So
yeah, his wife was born in Tipperary. Yeah. Her father was a head constable in the RIC, and he's now living near Lisburn. He's retired from the RIC, but her name was Frances Miller, and she's and the children, they've now got 6 children.
We don't know whether the whole family moved on, because 2 of the daughters were piano teachers at that stage, were they?
Yeah, no. Again, the curious thing about Baird is that he comes across such an almost kind of bourgeois family figure. They had about 6 different houses in Belfast, and each time they're moving up the property ladder, going from a 2 up, 2 down in Ardenvohr Street to their final house is like a sort of very spacious villa in East Belfast. And he's able to afford piano lessons for his daughters, particularly Nora, who becomes a very distinguished music teacher in Belfast and then later on in Australia. And ironically, she ends up getting an MBE from the Queen Mother as a reward for her services to music in schools in Australia.
So he moves down south but doesn't move his family with him.
No.
And this gives... He's organising in the southeast, and again, the ITGW are particularly strong. He's quite successful down there.
Yeah, in many parts of rural Ireland, the ITG is almost the only trade union, and they organise everybody, you know, farm workers, postmen, factory workers, dairy maids, canal workers, and so on. But you have
remind us of why labour, agricultural labour, moves in particular towards them in those years. Yeah,
because the First World War creates a shortage of labour on the land for the first time since the Napoleonic Wars. And initially, agricultural labourers formed their own unions or joined the land and labour associations. But they quickly joined the ITGW because it's more effective in securing pay increases. It's more effective as a wage militant organisation. Now, you're asking why the ITG gets so many agricultural labourers as members. And it's because it's an effective wage militant union. But in 1920, there are about 120,000 members in the union, and about half of them are agricultural labourers. So they're a key component of the union and indeed of the entire labour movement. But they have been enjoying...
You mentioned in the book about there being more labourers per head of population, per farm, in some counties than others. Would Waterford have been one of those?
Yes, Waterford was one of only 4 counties in Ireland where there were more than 2 labourers per farmer. So where the land tended to be not so good, notably the west of Ireland, you had more farmers than labourers. But in the richer counties in terms of their quality of their land, particularly the dairy counties, because dairy tends to be labour intensive, you had a higher proportion of labourers.
I know from looking at the 1911 census at our own farm in Wexford, there was 6 labourers on it at that stage.
Right, yeah.
But that was a mixed farm. It was mixed tillage, dairy, and...
Yeah. The bulk of members of the union in agriculture would have been in the southeast, yeah.
So this is strong farm. And at the same time, you have the strong organisation of the farmers' unions, the Irish Farmers Association.
Yeah.
Is it? And the Waterford Farmers Union, or have I got the union and association the wrong way around? Yeah,
the Irish Farmers Union is founded refounded arguably in 1917, and they gradually consolidate. The Waterford Farmers Association is founded also in 1917, and then they affiliate to the Irish Farmers Union. And as Labour gets stronger, more militant, the farmers also organise. And
under Sir John Keane.
Well, in Waterford, it's very much under Sir John Keane, who's he's a baronet who has a big estate near Cappoquin, and he's very much the country squire. Typical, I think, of the leadership of the IFU, who tend to be made up of ex-unionists who are making the transition to Home Rulers and then to nationalists or even Republicans, but people who've decided to stay on in the new state and want to make an investment in it and want to cultivate friendly relations with the new Commonwealth government.
And they've tended to move, rather than moving into national politics, they've moved into agricultural politics, which I think is a very interesting...
Yeah, because it's
a safe space for them.
Absolutely. In the 1922 general election, the Irish Farmers Union puts forward a political party, the Farmers' Party. They get 7 TDs elected. So they become, in theory, part of the opposition, but in practice they're very pro-government, pro-Commonwealth. And similarly, Commonwealth believe that the future of the country is bound up with the best interests of the farming community. and in particular the strong farmers. So they're very pro the interests of the farmers.
So what happens to bring this Waterford strike?
A demand for a pay cut. Waterford had reached fairly peak levels of wage increases during the boom times, when farmers had guaranteed prices from the government for their agricultural produce.
And this is particularly during the war?
This is during the war, and very much a consequence of the war. But then in 1921, the government decontrols agriculture. They end guaranteed prices. There's a crisis of overproduction generally. Prices started to fall, particularly in agriculture. And farmers are saying, no, prices are falling. Wages should fall too. And workers are saying, well, we've only now got a decent wage at last, after waiting decades, and we're not going to give it up. We're going to hold the harvest of wage gains, as they put it. But when
you look at the wages compared to other jobs, they do look quite decent. You know, they are surprisingly good. I was amazed to see, you know, compared to even what doctors might be earning at the time, that they weren't obviously on a par, but they were respectable.
Yeah, because the government set up the Agricultural Wages Board to introduce statutory wage limits or wage minimums. But again, they abolished the Agricultural Wages Board in 1921. So it's sort of a free market now, and the farmers are pressing for wage cuts, very severe wage cuts. So they want to cut wages in Waterford initially from 35 shillings, the headline rate of 35 shillings a week for an outdoor worker 6 days a week to 25 shillings. Then they agree to that to 28 shillings. Then they agree to 30 shillings, but they won't go beyond 30 shillings. The union is willing to accept a cut to 32 shillings, but they're told, look, there's no way that the farmers are going to go beyond 30 shillings. So there's no point in agreeing to 32 shillings.
So what happens on the ground? They're not doing the agricultural work? What is the...
Well, they go on strike now. How do you conduct a farm strike? It becomes very dirty, very messy, very brutal in some cases. So the tactic of the union is to put pressure on individual farmers, to go to farmers individually and say, look, will you sign up to the renewal of last year's wage rates? And if you do, you sign with the union, and we'll allow you to, you know, conduct your farming business as normal. If you don't, we'll impose an embargo on your farm. We won't allow you to trade. We won't allow you to move your goods, your animals. We'll even block food going into your house. So, you know, it's war to the knife, really, on both sides.
And of course, we're talking in an era when there aren't credit cards or bank loans to pay for things, and you're dependent on being able to get to the fair to sell your cattle or whatever, or to get to the merchants to sell your grain. And if you can't do that,
and you're talking about an era in which the country is just coming out of three, you know, fairly brutal wars: World War I, the War of Independence, and the Civil War. So people are inured to a lot of violence and willing to engage in a lot of violent activity on both sides. So, you know, within a few months, the farmers and labourers are trying to burn each other out. The labourers are...
And the government interferes?
Absolutely. They send in 2 battalions, the Special Infantry. They send in the Guards, the regular army. And basically they give full support to the farmers. The Minister for Agriculture, Paddy Hogan, TD for Clare, is 100% behind the farmers and behind people like Sir John Keane in the struggle.
And it ends then?
Yeah, within a few weeks, the union decides that we can't win this. They initially seek government arbitration. The farmers won't agree to that. They eventually resort to a stratagem. They try to encourage the farmers to issue a statement saying we won't go beyond our previous offer. The union would then says it will interpret that as an offer and recommend a return to work on that basis. But the farmers are not going to take yes for an answer. They want to humiliate the union, absolutely destroy it. So the union is left with the problem of supporting a strike it doesn't believe can be won, and indeed can't be won. And it looks as if it's going to bankrupt the entire union. And in December, just before Christmas, they say, we've just got to call it off. Sorry, that's the end. So they just cut off strike pay.
And that's the end of the famous, one of the greatest strikes in Irish history, as you describe it as.
It's not at the end of the Waterford farm strike. Yeah. It's the end of agricultural trade unionism for about 25 years.
It's a fascinating story. In the epilogue to the book, you describe his progress from Black Squad in Belfast down to being a black legend. You describe him as, and you describe how he's in the Dáil record, being described by Senator Patrick Kenny of Cumann Gael in the context of the union organisation and the Shannon electrification scheme that they were talking about at that stage. And he warned that lessons were to be had from the Waterford day, that one of the organisers was from Belfast, and he didn't, I suppose, know a turnip from a mangle. Yeah. And which shows the level of what he actually knew about Baird, because Baird was brought up on a farm. So, of course, he did know the difference between a turnip and a mangle, which anybody brought up on a farm would know. Do you know the difference between a turnip and a mangle?
I think you can eat a turnip, can't you?
Yeah.
Can you eat a mangle?
Some people might eat a mangle, but I wouldn't choose to.
Yeah.
They're usually for cattle. And you talk too about how he brings a kind of a northern attitude back down to southern trade union politics, I think, which was a very interesting perspective. Of course, that thing, when we were talking about this before, you were talking about how, the Waterford strike was unusual in that it was led by Protestants on both sides. One was a Northern Presbyterian and the other was an Anglican, I think, isn't he, from the south?
Yeah, so John Keane was very much the country squire and very, very much a church-going Anglican,
And that this is actually, again, a blindness in the historiography, that it's seldom mentioned that the leaders on both sides were actually Protestant, but different forms. There is a social tension, obviously, between them as well.
That's right, yeah. What's interesting is that nobody mentions the religion at all. Mm. So, which I suppose is commendable in many ways, but it's indicative of how maybe, as a point you've made it yourself, that attitudes towards religion in the south of Ireland can vary enormously from county to county.
Yeah, this is something we found in Dalton and I when we were looking at this. And even I have a student at the moment working on unionism in Waterford in this period, and he sees unionism as being much stronger than I would see it being in Wexford, which is my home county and main place of research focus. And I think that's interesting, therefore, that the strike happens there. It adds a double tension to what was going on in the era. Maybe to wrap up then, he moves to Australia, but why does he move?
I think he would have been blacked in Belfast. Would have been very difficult for him to get a job there. And his wife's people
because he's viewed as being too pro the South, too pro Home Rule.
Yeah, but also too red, too much of a militant, and a Labour activist.
Unemployable.
Yeah, and I mean, even 1924, the Belfast Newsletter is talking about Labour coming back to Belfast Corporation, saying, I hope this won't mean a return to the Dungarees, and that kind of mentality, So
I'd really love to know whether he'd washed before he went in, or was he still covered in black?
Grease, yeah. But his wife's people had relatives in Queensland, and they were saying, come out to Australia, it's a land of milk and honey. And you had to be sponsored, you see, if you wanted to emigrate. So they agreed to sponsor the Bairds. So they all moved out, except for his son moved to Canada. But the others of the family moved to Brisbane. And two of his daughters became very distinguished music teachers in Brisbane, Nora
and a very kind
Helene.
Of middle-class life, it sounds like, again.
Yeah, he did, in that, he was very concerned that he should provide for his daughters. And, obviously, he took pains to afford piano lessons for them. And he was fairly ecumenical as regards Presbyterianism and Anglicanism. The family kind of moved fairly easily back and forth between the two. But he's very clear that he wasn't a Catholic.
Yeah. I found it fascinating too that the family got in touch after your book came out, was it?
Yeah,
or after
both sides of the family got in touch. Yeah. Unfortunately, a little bit too late. But they did very generously give me some personal information on Baird and on Francis, his wife. And I hope that they'll be included in a second edition of the book.
And you're going forward, your next book is again going to be in this field?
Yes, I want to write the definitive history of the big farm strike in Waterford, in which, of course, James Baird is very centrally involved. Bits and pieces have been written on it, but I want to do a very comprehensive study of what was one of the most important strikes in Irish labour history.
I do hope the Milnes weren't involved, or maybe I do. But Emmet, thank you so much. This has been really interesting, and I'm looking forward very much to your next book.
Thank you very much.